Now back to our top story on the murder trial of former police officer Derek Chauvin. Let's deepen the conversation now as lawyer Walter White Jr. joins us now. Walter, good to have you.
Thank you.
Excellent. I'll just jump straight in. Watching the prosecution opening sentence yesterday, it would seem, and especially when we watch the 8 minutes, 46 seconds, of that video that is ingrained in all our minds, it would seem that the case is an open and shut one. So what possible defense could Chauvin's group have now?
Well, yesterday, the first part of the prosecution's opening statement and their first three witnesses were an excruciatingly detailed walk through 9 minutes and 29 seconds of the videotape that showed that Officer Derek Chauvin had his knee on George Floyd's neck and back. It is the prosecution's view that this was the officer placing his entire body weight on Floyd's neck and back, and which shut down oxygen to his brain and lungs, as well as blood flow to the brain. The defense takes a different position, that Floyd died of heart arrhythmia aggravated by a drug cocktail leading to a drug overdose. There will be a lot of expert testimony addressing the, quote, true cause of death, as there are dueling medical examiners who drew different conclusions. It's worth noting that in addition to whether or not the knee on the neck was the cause of death, arguably a contributing cause, and I note that the officer also had an affirmative responsibility to provide assistance to Floyd, who was in obvious distress. The defense will argue that Floyd was dangerous and that the restraint was necessary, though that's hard to justify when he was down for 9 minutes.
Well, indeed. The George Floyd family legal team say America is on trial here. However, yesterday, Judge Peter Cahill said it is a police officer that is on trial here and not the race in America. What should be central? What is the central question to this entire trial?
Well, there's no question that this is an individual case against Derek Chauvin, and it will be the first ramification is that this gets into the context of a long tradition of police abuse against African Americans and other minority ethnic groups in the United States. And very few policemen or police officers have been charged with the crime as a result of violence against people of color. So in the event that Derek Chauvin is not convicted, given the videotape evidence that is front and center, there will be great concern about the question of whether or not Black Lives Matter to the police force.
Okay, let's turn our attention to the issue of the burden of proof. There was some discussion had yesterday with regards to the fact that in Minneapolis, you're dealing with substantive cause as opposed to, I'm trying to, so you're the lawyer here. Help us understand the implications of the fact that we're talking about substantive cause of death as opposed to what would have been the alternative.
Well, the burden of, but the question in relationship to, quote, reasonable versus substantial cause of death is that the jury does not need to decide that Derek Chauvin was the only reason that that Derek Chauvin killed him outright. If the activity of Derek Chauvin, the knee on the back and the neck for 9.5 minutes, is a contributing cause, if it is a substantive cause to the death of George Floyd, then that is sufficient. But the burden of proof of proving that remains with the prosecution.
Well, Walter White Jr., stay with us. We'll go on a quick break and we'll continue this conversation. Okay, I'm told that we have a bit more time before we go on that break. We've listened to three witnesses already. The first prosecution witness was a police officer, a police dispatcher, pardon, Jenny Scurry, who watched all of this happen on police cameras. But she said she had to do what she'd never done in her career all this while. She had to call the police on the police. What's at stake here, Walter?
Well, what the prosecutor is doing is he is going to witnesses to validate and verify everything that is on the videotape. And the fact that a 9/11 operator had the ability to discern that something was seriously wrong is an indicator that the police at the scene should have recognized that something was seriously wrong and they should have behaved differently.
Okay. I think I can squeeze this in, or if I can't, then we'll carry it over after the break. What is the probability that, in like less than a minute, what is the probability that Chauvin will be found guilty, and what would be the consequence of that? What sort of impact would that have?
Well, my assessment is that the evidence is very strong. The challenge, of course, is there's not a strong tradition of white officers being convicted and killing black men and women in America. There are several loopholes in the law. The impact, this with some very racist traditions in America, make this case that high profile. And if they win, it will be a signal that police officers can be held accountable and should be held accountable. If the prosecution loses, then it will be perceived as a signal that it is still not possible to hold white police officers responsible for the death of black people in America.
All right, Walter, we'll go on that break now, but we'll be back to talk some more with you, so please stay with us.
Okay, we're back on Newsday, and let's continue to deepen the discussion with lawyer Walter White Jr. as we discuss issues of the Derek Chauvin trial, as well as gun control. Adeswa.
Thank you very much, Ekene. Well, Walter, I was just about to ask you, considering we've seen different angles of that harrowing video evidence and the volume of evidence and the numbers of witnesses that may be involved in this trial, what is to happen next, and how long do you think this will last?
The honest answer is I don't know how long it will last. My expectation is it will take at least 2 weeks. It could take 4. The number of witnesses will be to lay down a concrete presentation in relationship to the damage that was done by Derek Chauvin. It is the defense will clearly have the opportunity to respond, though I don't expect the defense will put on as many witnesses. The defense will simply try to obfuscate and say, this wasn't a problem. He was a big, dangerous black man, and we needed this level of restraint in order to keep the situation under control. And he died of drugs, not as a result of the restraint.
Okay.
Aspects of the trial will be ugly.
Okay. Okay, interesting. It would be good to know what aspects, but I imagine the whole thing is a very emotional experience for many Americans. But let's look to the fact that many are optimistic that America is ripe for change as concerns issues relating to Black Lives Matter. We saw that there was the George Floyd bill that was processed before even this trial. And do you feel that President Joe Biden's presence is somehow playing its part in weighing on the scales towards this paradigm shift at this time?
Well, Biden's presence will not weigh on the trial itself. But, of course, Trump was an avowed white supremacist and actually encouraged violence against American ethnic groups. Biden has evolved into the more American tradition of equal justice for all. And it's not insignificant that the black vote has led to Biden's victory and his presidency. So he's definitely more sensitive to institutional racism in police forces and in other aspects of American society. And there is a commitment, and there will be a commitment with Kamala Harris, that aspects of American racist traditions need to change.
Well, let's look at the defense possible arguments here, talking about George Floyd's experiences with drug abuse and COVID-19. How much of a weight does this carry?
It should have none. You don't have to be a good person to have a right to not be murdered by the police or anyone else. And and if he were a drug addict, and if he were laying in the street or walking around as a drug addict, the proper cause of action would be to get him to a place where he could get help. It's not to kneel on his neck for 9.5 minutes. Okay,
I'm glad you're separating the issues. So let's look at drug control, at least for a moment, and because that's another topic that's on the front burner with the funeral at Boulder on today, and the recent shootings at the Spa in Atlanta. There's a certain relationship Americans have with their weapons, their rifles, that maybe an onlooker may not understand. It seems to almost have an identity value. Can you help us understand where this came from? Does it go back to the Wild West?
No, actually, it goes back to slavery. In the South, during the 17th, 18th centuries in particular, white people were actually outnumbered by their slaves. And so it was necessary, or they thought it was necessary, for them to have guns, and a lot of them, in order to keep their slaves under control.
Interesting. And because it segues quite ironically into what we're dealing with on the Black Lives Matter and to do with the George Floyd case. So are you saying that the attachment to their weapons is somehow intrinsic to their feeling of superiority? I'm getting you to infer now why it's such a thorny issue in America.
It's not an inference. Historical facts would lay that foundation. Historical facts also lay the foundation of the first police departments in the United States of great significance were largely police departments to control slaves in the South, to keep them from revolting and under control and from escaping. So there's a tradition in the historical police department development and a tradition in relationship to guns that is also quite disturbing and ugly.
Okay. Well, thank you, Walter White Jr. That's all we have time for, but thank you for the insight you brought on these very disturbing issues that are up for discussion.